Hello, I'm Leslie Chapman Henderson, President and CEO of Laatsch, the nonprofit Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. I will be your host today for our podcast, Strong Homes, Safe Families. Today, we're talking about a new study that makes the economic case for building codes called Building Code Safe, a nationwide study. Our guest is the Director of Safety Planning and Building Science Division of the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, Risk Management Director within FEMA. He's a longtime Laatsch partner, and he's one of our nation's leading experts on building science, as well as one of the most respected voices in the disaster safety movement. Please help me welcome Ed Laatsch.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time, and we're very excited because we know that our listeners are going to be very, very interested in learning about the study. So before we get started there, can you tell me and all of us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your professional journey that brought you to FEMA?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. So I think the simplest place to start is that I've had a lifelong interest. I've always been interested in how things work, and I've always been curious about the world around me. And as far as education goes, my background is I have degrees in civil engineering and architecture, and I am a licensed civil engineer. And so that sets the tone for where I've spent much of my professional career. I've been involved in building science per se, or the areas surrounding building codes and how to build things better or well for over 30 years with different organizations. Prior to that, I spent some time doing a variety of things, including even an interesting period where I was working as a blast effects engineer, designing Department of Defense munitions facilities to withstand bomb explosions. And while that seems disconnected, in some ways it all helped me understand different aspects of building design. So my engineering career started with me working in some architectural engineering or AE engineering firms in the Washington, D.C. area. As I said, following a short detour looking at blast design effects, I went to work for the National Association of Home Builders, first at the Research Center and then later as part of their main association. And during that 7 years, learned a lot about building technology, building science, everything from radon gas to faulty stucco, up to and including things like plumbing and sink performance. So there was a lot of different things that I was exposed to and learned about the building sciences. Following that, and following Hurricane Andrew, I had the opportunity to go to work for State Farm Insurance. They had the unfortunate experience of having lost about $8 billion in one day following Hurricane Andrew, and they reached out to look for some folks that could help them study their losses as a result of Hurricane Andrew, as well as try to learn lessons about how to reduce their exposure and reduce their losses. I spent some time there, and finally, in 1999, an opportunity came up for me to come to work for FEMA, which is where I've been ever since. I guess the last thing I'd say is we've seen a lot of change. When I first started with FEMA, it was under the tenure of the well-known and well-respected Director James Lee Witt. And over that period of time, and over all these jobs I've had, I guess I will close, Leslie, by saying it's been very interesting to have an opportunity to look at these problems from different perspectives, to see how building science works, what its challenges were, how we could advance the science and the practice of building science from different perspectives, from the designer's perspective, from the insurance industry's perspective, from the contractor and builder's perspective, and now finally from the perspective of the federal government, whose mission is to try to support and develop disaster-resistant building codes and make the world safer.
Got an incredible, you've had so many different perspectives and directions from which to look at the problem. And what it all comes down to is what happens when a building is tested, whether by, and I did not know that you spent time at DOD looking at bomb blasts, whether by, human caused reasons for the test on the structure or that natural hazard. So what is the primary focus of your role today in your leadership role at FEMA right now?
My role probably hasn't changed all that much over the 30-some years I've been doing this. I came to FEMA as a subject matter expert, and I've had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to move up, become a supervisor, and now we'll call it division director or a manager. And really the only change is I've gone from having the privilege of being part of a group of really talented, skilled individuals and partners that are all helping FEMA's mission of helping people before, during, after disasters. And now I've had the privilege of moving to working through others and to trying to help support and lead this exciting and dynamic group of federal professionals and, as I say, partners and others, all driving towards this goal of resilient communities, hazard-resistant nation, and improved building construction and all that.
So we're talking about a new product, and I know you guys look at the information and studies and analysis and everything you do as a product that is useful to advancing this understanding of building performance and building science. The new Building Code Saves study, what's the top line description of what you've been doing with that study and what the undertaking is all about?
The simplest way to describe it is that we have now, for the first time, finished a nationwide estimate of what we're going to call the losses that have been avoided as a result of adopting and enforcing disaster-resistant building codes across the nation. So generally, that's what we are studying. We're looking specifically at the flood peril, the wind peril, and the earthquake peril, and those places within the U.S. where we know there is a significant risk for those disasters. And frankly, you put those three together, that's a lot of the United States. But we're looking specifically at those three hazards across the nation, and we're bringing a lot of data and some of our tools, some tools that FEMA and others have developed, like the hazardous loss estimation model, data around the nation's building parcels, and a great deal of other information all together to produce an estimate of what benefits have we gained as a result of adopting and enforcing improved building codes. And for the purpose of this study, that means adoption of the international codes, a national group of model building codes first published in the year 2000. So with the year 2000 as our starting point, we have looked across the last 18 years in these at-risk areas and said, of all the new buildings and residential structures built over those 18 years, that is our universe. The question is, what have we gained? What have we learned? And what have we advanced by way of avoided losses because of these communities using and enforcing those codes?
So can you describe some of the community level case studies that you guys examined as part of the study?
Certainly. There are a number. There was 18 million parcels across the United States that ultimately we looked at. But more broadly, more specifically than that, a couple of examples of areas where communities are dealing with the escalating natural disaster threat. In the earthquake peril, we can look at a place like Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City, we're recently estimating that a major earthquake of magnitude 6 or more resulted in losses of over $48 or $49 million. But they're saying there's about a 99% chance that somewhere over the next 30 to 50 years, they're going to experience a far more powerful earthquake that could well result in losses of billions of dollars. Similarly, if you look at the tornado threat in the Central Plains and the Gulf of Mexico area, there was a serious series of tornado events in 2019 in North Texas. It resulted in almost $2 billion in losses. And so we are looking at ways to mitigate some of those effects and to find ways to, through building codes and through strong building code adoption enforcement, to reduce those losses. Another one in the Mississippi River area, a flooding event that occurred in 2019 on the Mississippi River resulted over a course of the spring flooding season, almost $20 billion in losses and the loss of 12 lives. But in the future, we're looking at what looks like might be even more frequent and more intense disaster issues. And so we know there's a significant threat, and we know that these are areas we wish to try to help drive down the impacts of these disasters.
So it sounds like it's an attempt to help people understand what won't happen and the cost benefit of doing it that way, because building codes are so essential, but it's so hard to prove a negative, right? I think for people just coming into this, if you're looking at building codes as an essential element and maybe even the most essential foundation of disaster resilience and communities' ability to bounce back, as we've always considered it, why is it that building codes are not already adopted and enforced consistently across the United States?
That's an interesting question. That's not necessarily the simplest question to answer, but let me describe it this way. Building codes are developed and regulated at the state and local level, not the federal level, which means that we have 50 states and various territories, and each of those states and territories have jurisdiction over what kind of building code they have, what the specific requirements of it are, and how it's adopted and enforced. We have nationally a model code that many, but not all of these states use as a basis for their codes. That's the international codes promulgated by the International Code Council. There is a wide variety or wide variance in how codes are adopted. Some states adopt them at the state level. Others don't have state codes, but let local jurisdictions adopt. And there's various manifestations of that. What it means is that any approach to improving or changing building codes has to be not only nationwide, but it also has to focus on all of the differences and different ways in which codes are adopted and enforced across the country. So it requires perseverance, it requires time, and it requires different approaches in different places.
So it sounds like it's a challenge with regard to getting building codes in place on a systematic basis. It sounds like there's a very real resource aspect to this because of the cost of adopting and training and administering codes, right? But also maybe just prioritization. So do you think that the study will help decision makers with an economic case as profound as you've uncovered in the study? Do you think that's beneficial to those that have to make the decision on how to allocate limited resources?
Absolutely. Jurisdictionally, we all know that there's a great many demands on the use of local tax dollars and state tax dollars. There's many things that compete for those dollars. And building regulation, which in many cases is actually funded by building construction permitting, is one that can ebb and flow. And it can be a challenge for local jurisdictions to maintain just the level of resourcing and the level of staffing support they need to do all or to do everything they would like to do. So it is an ongoing challenge, and where possible, we're always looking for ways to give local jurisdictions information and justifications or rationales for why they need to prioritize their building codes activities. This study, I think, and I believe, shows quite clearly that in building codes actually pays very significant dividends.
And I have been very honored to be a part of the fourth phase of the study as a part of the advisory council. One of the things that I've really appreciated about the effort here and the commitment you guys have had to getting this done is that we in this country, because it's human nature, we tend to be pretty strong advocates for building code adoption and prioritizing those resources after a disaster kind of reveals the case. But what things like this study could potentially do is move that prioritization to the pre-disaster when the blue skies are there, right? And nothing's happened yet. And I guess that's the whole focus of things like this, to get it into people's minds and into the set of local decisions before it happens. But it can't be done if you don't have an economic case. I think that's one of the key things here and that's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast and want to get the word out, is it's an incredibly powerful tool for those that have to make those tough decisions. So we really commend you for that, because it's hard to compete at the local level when you only have so much to allocate about. One of the other things about this, Ed, is that when a disaster strikes a community, not all residents are affected the same way. A lot of times, again, because of economic means, some are disproportionately harmed, and the recovery and the bounce back is a much longer journey that sometimes people can't even complete. Do you think that building codes are relevant for the underserved communities in particular?
Not only relevant, I think, but particularly helpful over the long haul. Underserved communities, as we all know, often find themselves also located in areas of higher risk. Oftentimes, and we've seen this in places like following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that we find that some of the folks who are in underserved communities may also be at a disadvantage in terms of being located at or near flood-prone areas, or located at or near seismic faults, or I guess what we'll simply call potentially less desirable locations that are more affordable and are easier for these folks to find housing in. But that said, how you can best support underserved communities is by having communities adopt a strong building code. Yes, the strong building code initially impacts new construction and buildings as they come online. And of course, you say there are many buildings that existed prior to, or going back through time, perhaps quite a ways back to a period where building codes weren't as effective or weren't as strong. But as some of these buildings are affected, as some of these buildings find themselves damaged or falling under repair and replacement provisions of mortgage provisions or government support provisions. These are all opportunities for that rebuilding to be done better, or that repair to be done in a way that improves the resilience and the safety of these buildings. And in any event, in time, as time goes by and as we build better, and as those buildings go through their life cycle and then come into the possession of folks that may be less well served, they all eventually and inevitably will gain the benefit of a strong building code.
So I guess we know that sometimes the perceived cost of having building codes is a very strong barrier, even if the way we define cost of codes is different for some versus others. And with respect to this community in particular, the cost can't simply be the cost of acquisition of the home. We have to look at the cost over time, the cost of being dislodged from your home, or the cost of repairs, either ordinary or caused by a disaster as well. In the study itself, you did look at costs, and there was some estimation of the average cost of building codes and some different discovery items there. Are there any of those in particular that you think are persuasive to make the case for building codes?
Well, we certainly hope so. A couple that I might point out. One of the things that we note in the study, and that's backed up by other work done by others before us, including a study done by NIBS a few years back, is the cost of building homes in a disaster-resistant fashion versus sort of meeting the minimum requirements of the code, taking those extra steps to either protect windows or roofs in hurricane-prone areas, or to connect and fasten the home together well in a seismic-resistant area, or elevating the home a bit in a flood-prone area, things of that sort. It's a couple of percent. It's not a lot of money. We're seeing numbers like 2% or less. That is not an amount of money that's likely to result in a make or break decision on home ownership or home rental. We think that that's a small price to pay. And I think that the demonstrated savings we're seeing, I'll give you an example. In the flood peril, our study identifies that based on those elements we studied, and it was certainly not the entirety of the universe of flood loss reduction, something in the neighborhood of a little short of $500 million a year is being saved by virtue of the fact that some of these buildings are being slightly elevated. That elevation is reducing the risk of those buildings considerably. And if we compare, we go through the report and look through the numbers, you'll see that on average, these flood-prone homes that we studied that took advantage and gained the benefit of that additional elevation ultimately winds up saving those homeowners about $1,200 a year, every year, over time. And $1,200 a year in many cases is about or as much or near the cost of their annual flood insurance premium. I happen to think that's a pretty fair investment for a pretty fair return.
That's extraordinary. And what was the projected savings over the 20-year period estimated in loss reduction?
Absolutely. And so if I haven't mentioned it yet, one of the bottom line takeaways from the study is that we are estimating, based on the features we have studied for those three perils, and they are not by any means inclusive, we're looking at savings of a minimum of $1.6 billion a year. And that $1.6 billion represents a few key bricks and mortar adjustments and improvements for the flood, wind, and earthquake resistance of those structures. It does not count so many other things like business losses, loss of use, loss of personal property. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And if you take that number and you look more broadly at it and say, what does that look like over the next 20 years? And following that old version, that view of what they call compounding interests, you see that the calculated avoided losses over the next 20 years could easily be 32 billion or more. And if you look out 40 years, the area under this curve just grows and grows. You could be looking at $130 billion or more between now and 2040. So over a 40-year period, these numbers get very large, and the amount of savings to the nation and individuals become very large indeed.
That's incredible. And I think that I want to remind our listeners, as we always do, that we'll have show notes and we'll have a link to a phenomenal shorter brochure that describes the study as well as the study itself as it's about to be released. So we've talked about building codes as a challenge, the study as an economic proof point and evidence and tool to help, those in charge of the decision making make the case that codes are a terrific investment, not just for today, but for decades to come. And it's a huge challenge to do this, and you've provided a great tool. So how can our partners at the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes from the private sector, other public sector partners, and other nonprofits like us, how can we help support this cause and move this phenomenal insight into action to create a stronger building code system for the U.S.?
There are a number of things that I believe our partners, you, and so many others, including the public, can do. And I think that much of it starts with what I'll call messaging, or being able to put forward a strong story and the reasons for why taking action or encouraging others to take action to put in place strong building codes that are well enforced. People need to understand why it's important, and they need to understand in their day-to-day lives why it's important enough to take action. Building codes is important, but a lot of people don't really understand that. And Leslie, as you well know, a study that your organization has done looking at building code awareness under the title of No Code, No Confidence showed, amongst other things, but most principally, that people's understandings and expectations about what building codes do and what value they bring is pretty wildly out of line with the reality. Your organization discovered that people assume that building codes are everywhere, they're strong, they're enforced, and there's no variance. And when they find out, or they're allowed to go look and see what the codes are like in their place, they're surprised and often not very happy to find out that in many cases, that is not in fact the case. In fact, one of the statistics we've determined is that something like 2/3 of the jurisdictions in the United States do not have a building code that is based on the current or the next most current version of their codes, meaning 2/3 of America has building codes that are more than 6 years old, which means a number of changes have happened and those codes are not as current as they should be. So the messaging has to start with making people aware that they do in fact have a code, that it may or may not meet their expectations, and then what they can do about it. So broad-based support, subject matter experts from all around the country are all brought in to help us develop. As the study is concluded, it's going to be very important for us to make sure we're reaching out to all of our partners, the states and locals, the public, and everybody else who has a stake in strong building codes. And frankly, that's just about all of us, to see if we can get the word out and create a real public value for strong building codes.
Wow. So I want to congratulate you on this effort, because as I read about it and participated in it, and long before I got involved, this was a nearly 8-year project with the 4 phases. And I know that our listeners and our partners are very excited about the opportunity of how this is going to help them make a difference. But before we wrap up, I want to just give you an opportunity to, your career, as you said, there's the organizing principle of being so fascinated by how things work, but having those different perspectives on in your career across all the different roles you've played. What is the one thing that you want us to know before we conclude today?
So that's a lot to roll up, but I would leave you with this, Leslie. In order to make this goal or this mission a success and to have strong building codes all across the nation, we are going to have to create a public value and a powerful story and set of messaging around these codes based on hard facts and hard science, as well as strongly connected personal stories of people who were affected both well and poorly around building codes. And frankly, that public value does not currently exist. So what we really have to focus on now is helping to create that value all across the nation for all of our stakeholders. And to do that, we hope that this study will be one part of many other elements that can all come together and help create that.
Well, thank you for your service, your continued service, and your leadership for all of us. It's so helpful to have someone like you bringing us together and providing us with these tools. So I want to thank you for taking the time to give us a preview of this exciting study and for joining us on our podcast. For our listeners, I want to remind you that we will have the study, the brochure, and the information that we've talked about today. There's so much here to learn, and if we have the opportunity, we may come back in 6 months and talk more about how things are going in the study, because I know, Ed, that your work continues. I want to ask everyone to please visit us at flash.org if they need information on how to protect their home and family from disasters, and remind you that our content's available in English and Spanish. And if you don't want to go digital, you can call us toll free at 877-221-SAFE. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, rate, share, and provide us a review on iTunes. And this will wrap us up until next time.